The man once called England's Golden Prince died a rotting, bloated shadow of his former self. His legs were so ulcerated that pus soaked through his bandages daily. The smell of decay followed him into every room. He couldn't walk, couldn't ride, couldn't even stand without help. Servants carried him in custom-made chairs. His once charming smile had twisted into a permanent scowl. This was Henry VIII at the end, feared, avoided, and physically falling apart. But he hadn't always been this way. In his youth, Henry had everything. He wasn't born to be king. That role belonged to his older brother Arthur, but fate handed him the crown at just 17. He was tall, athletic, strikingly handsome. He could ride, hunt, dance, compose music, debate scholars, and charm any court in Europe. He was, for a brief moment, the embodiment of promise. The people loved him. Nobles praised him. Foreign ambassadors sent home glowing reports. Henry VIII was to be the perfect Renaissance king. But the rot began early, not just in his body, but in his mind. A need for control, an obsession with legacy, paranoia, rage. As the years passed, the golden glow dimmed, and then something happened that accelerated the fall. This story isn't about a hero or a villain. It's about transformation, decay, the slow collapse of a king whose body and soul crumbled before his nation's eyes. This is the story of how the Golden Prince became the monstrous king, and it starts not with triumph, but with rot. Imagine a warm summer day in 1536, the air buzzing with excitement and anticipation. The grand tilt-yard of Greenwich Palace is alive with the sounds of trumpets, cheering crowds, and the clatter of hooves against the packed earth. England's nobility has gathered to witness a magnificent jousting tournament, an event fit for kings and knights, a spectacle of bravery, skill, and honor. At the center of it all is Henry VIII, the larger-than-life king known across Europe for his fiery red beard, towering stature, and imposing presence. Only in his mid-40s, Henry is no longer the lithe, athletic prince of his youth, but he still carries himself with the confidence and swagger of a man who rules one of the most powerful kingdoms on earth. Today, Henry isn't just watching from the sidelines. He's participating, as was his custom, charging into battle atop his favored horse, lance aimed forward, eyes blazing with fierce determination. Jousting is more than a sport to Henry. It is a declaration of power, a vivid reminder to all who watch that he is England's mightiest ruler, unchallenged in strength and spirit. But fate has other plans. As Henry's horse gallops full tilt toward his opponent, the ground beneath them shifts in an instant. Perhaps a rut or a patch of uneven turf, something unseen in the chaos of the tournament, causes the horse to stumble. Suddenly, the powerful animal pitches forward and crashes violently to the ground. In that terrifying moment, Henry is thrown from his saddle, the world spinning beneath him. His legs buckle awkwardly beneath the weight of his own body and the crashing horse. The impact is devastating. Henry's leg is caught beneath the enormous bulk of his horse, and a sickening snap echoes through the crowd. Bone breaks. Flesh tears. The pain is immediate and overwhelming. The crowd, once roaring with excitement, falls into stunned silence. Courtiers, nobles, and commoners alike hold their breath as men rush to the fallen king's side. Henry lies on the ground, gasping, his face pale and slick with sweat. The proud warrior who once led armies and hunted with unparalleled vigor is now helpless, crushed beneath his own mount. Doctors and attendants swarm the scene. There's talk of broken bones, perhaps a shattered femur or tibia. The injury is severe, but in an age before modern medicine, the true danger lies not in the break itself, but in what comes next. The wound is open and deep. The risk of infection, of gangrene setting in, is terrifyingly high. Medicine in the 16th century is primitive. Treatments are crude, and hospitals are places many fear to enter. Henry is carried back to his chambers. The king, who once strode through his palaces like a god, is now confined to bed, his once powerful leg encased in splints, throbbing with pain. This accident, though seemingly a single moment in time, marks a turning point, not just for Henry VIII, but for the entire English realm. From this day forward, Henry's health would decline, his mobility diminish, and his temperament darken. The accident would haunt him physically and mentally, shaping the final years of his reign. It would change everything. The accident was just the beginning of a nightmare that would haunt Henry VIII for the rest of his life. In the days and weeks after that fateful fall, the king's injuries turned from painful to perilous. The broken leg, trapped under the weight of his massive horse, did not heal as anyone had hoped. Instead, it became infected. In a time before antibiotics or antiseptics, infections like this were often death sentences. Flesh would rot away, wounds would fester, and the stench of decay filled the air. For Henry, the wound turned into a grotesque, festering ulcer. His doctors tried everything: poultices, herbal salves, bloodletting, but the infection only spread deeper and deeper. The king's leg became swollen, purple, and blackened in places. The pain was unbearable, but worse than the agony was the humiliation. Imagine a king who once strode through his castles with power and grace, now confined to a chamber, unable to walk without assistance, his skin breaking down, the stench of decay surrounding him. Courtiers whispered behind closed doors. Rumors spread like wildfire through the palace. The mighty Henry was becoming a prisoner of his own body, a rotting king, slowly succumbing to infection. But Henry's temperament would not allow him to be defeated so easily. Despite the unbearable pain, he demanded to be seen as strong. He insisted on continuing to rule, issuing orders from his bed, commanding his council with an iron will. His pride, however, masked a growing darkness. The king grew irritable, suspicious, and cruel. The pain made him volatile, and the fear of losing control consumed him. Every day was a battle, not just with his body, but with the creeping sense that he was no longer the invincible monarch he once was. In the quiet hours of the night, when the servants left him alone with his thoughts and the seeping wound, Henry faced the terrifying reality. His body was failing him. The rotting king was no longer just a metaphor. It was a dreadful truth. This infection was more than a physical curse. It became a symbol of the decay spreading through Henry's reign. The breakdown of alliances, the crumbling of relationships, and the storm brewing within the heart of England itself. By the mid-1540s, Henry VIII was a prisoner of his own body. His once formidable frame, broad-shouldered and agile, had become an unmanageable bulk. His waist reportedly measured over 50 inches. His leg, plagued by a recurring ulcer, constantly oozed pus and blood. The wound emitted a smell so putrid that some courtiers found excuses to avoid being in his presence for too long. Dressing him was a daily ordeal, requiring layers of padding, bandaging, and manpower. Walking was no longer an option. Even standing became dangerous. He was carried in reinforced chairs or moved on wheeled platforms. Rooms were rearranged to reduce the need for movement. His world shrank to accommodate his limbs, his wound, his weight. But his authority did not shrink with it. If anything, it intensified. The less he could move, the more brutal he became. Ministers were dismissed at the flick of a finger. Former confidants were condemned by signature alone. He didn't need to stand to execute power. He only needed a quill. Pain did not humble him. It hardened him. He blamed others for his suffering. He accused doctors of incompetence. He resented young courtiers for their strength. Even his closest companions approached with caution. A wrong word, a failed answer, a glance that lingered too long on his leg. Any of these could end in disgrace or death. Yet Henry maintained the illusion of kingship. Public appearances were carefully staged. Curtains concealed his entrance. Elaborate thrones disguised his inability to stand. When ambassadors visited, the king remained seated, towering in presence if not in posture. What remained of Henry VIII was no longer regal, but absolute. His stillness became menacing. He was a man who ruled not in motion, but by gravity alone. A mass no one dared challenge, and no one could truly approach. With his body betraying him and his movements painfully limited, Henry VIII's physical decline quickly began to shape the very atmosphere of his court. What was once a vibrant center of celebration, politics, and grandeur slowly transformed into something far darker, a palace ruled by fear. Imagine walking through the grand halls of Hampton Court or Whitehall Palace during these later years of Henry's reign. The tapestries still hung on the walls, the chandeliers still gleamed, but there was a chill in the air, an unspoken tension that made even the bravest courtiers tread carefully. Henry's fiery temper, once tempered by youth and ambition, had grown sharper and more unpredictable. The pain from his leg, combined with his frustration at his failing health, made him quick to anger and prone to sudden outbursts. No one, not even his closest advisors or favorite courtiers, was safe from his wrath. Whispers and rumors filled the corridors. Stories spread of servants disappearing overnight, of trusted nobles falling out of favor and being banished or even executed. The king's paranoia deepened, convinced that plots were everywhere, against his throne, his family, even his very life. This paranoia wasn't entirely unfounded. Henry's reign had always been marked by intrigue and betrayal. Yet in these final years, his suspicion intensified to almost unbearable levels. Every smile was scrutinized, every glance questioned. His wives bore the brunt of this growing fear. Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, Catherine Parr. Each woman was caught in a delicate, dangerous game. A wrong word, a perceived slight, or simply falling out of favor could mean ruin or worse. The palace itself became a cage, filled with silent watchers and nervous whispers. Courtiers learned to smile when the king was pleased and disappear when he was not. Even the music and laughter that once filled the royal court grew muted, replaced by cautious steps and anxious glances. Henry's court, once a dazzling center of Renaissance culture and politics, had become a kingdom ruled not just by the king's laws, but by the shadow of fear. It was a palace where trust was scarce, loyalty was fragile, and the cost of a misstep could be deadly. And at the heart of it all sat Henry, a king imprisoned not only by his failing body, but by the growing darkness in his mind. By this stage, Henry's marriages were not romantic endeavors. They were tools of state, blunt, transactional, and disposable. The court had already been reshaped by fear, but inside the king's private chambers, fear took on another form: unpredictability. The same ruler who once penned sonnets now issued death warrants to women he had once called his queens. If a wife failed to deliver a son, or simply failed to keep his attention, she was swept aside. Politically, and sometimes literally, their heads rolled. Catherine of Aragon, his first queen, had been too pious, too immovable. She aged while Henry sought renewal. Her failure to produce a surviving male heir was not merely a personal disappointment. It was, in Henry's mind, a threat to dynastic stability. She was discarded, and with her, the old alliance with Spain. The Church of England was born in the wreckage of that union, not out of conviction, but necessity. Anne Boleyn, his so-called passion, was once a symbol of transformation, but soon became an inconvenient reminder of promises unkept. She too failed to bear him a son. When whispers of flirtation became accusations of treason, adultery, and incest, Henry needed no convincing. The machinery of execution turned, and Anne's head was taken from her shoulders by a French swordsman. Jane Seymour gave him a son and promptly died. Henry mourned, but not deeply enough to remain unwed for long. Anne of Cleves arrived next, a diplomatic arrangement he found physically revolting. The marriage was annulled with speed. Catherine Howard followed, young, unwise, and eventually unfaithful. She died screaming, her crime a mirror of Anne Boleyn's. Last came Catherine Parr, more nurse than queen, whose primary achievement was survival. Each wife revealed something about Henry's needs, his insecurities, and his desperation for legacy. But none were mourned in truth. Their ends were not the heartbreak of a tragic novel, but the logical consequence of Henry's withering tolerance for disobedience, infertility, or inconvenience. What broke in these marriages was not Henry's heart. It was the illusion that England's monarchy remained guided by affection, principle, or God. By now, the only enduring union left was between the king and his absolute will. By now, the king's world had shrunk to a narrow, suffocating space, defined entirely by his obsession with control. Henry VIII's once vigorous body was ravaged by disease and neglect. His legs, swollen and ulcerated, exuded a foul stench that no amount of treatment could hide. Each step was an ordeal, and walking long distances was impossible. The once tall, broad-shouldered figure who had dominated tournaments and battlefields was now a shadow. his bloated frame tethered to a throne that seemed as much a prison as a seat of power. Yet within his deteriorating body, Henry's mind burned with relentless intensity. He still saw himself as England's architect and absolute master, the living embodiment of divine will. The king no longer rode horses or wielded weapons. He was confined indoors, his movements sluggish and limited. But his desire to control the kingdom had not diminished. It had only sharpened into something far more dangerous. Paranoia consumed him. He suspected betrayal everywhere, real or imagined. Allies who had served loyally were branded traitors overnight. Men like Thomas More and Thomas Cromwell, once pillars of Henry's court, were abruptly cast down, imprisoned, and executed with brutal finality. Proximity to the king became a perilous position. One misstep, a cautious word turned suspicious, could seal a noble's fate. Fear was the currency of survival. The royal court twisted itself into a grotesque performance. Courtiers no longer dared offer honest counsel or speak inconvenient truths. Instead, they became mere shadows of themselves, echoing the king's fears and affirming his delusions. Silence was safer than dissent. Flattery replaced wisdom. The palace echoed with hollow compliance. Religious upheaval mirrored this dangerous madness. Henry had severed ties with the Catholic Church and declared himself supreme head of the Church of England. This move was less about faith and more about control. The king's shifting suspicions dictated religious policy. Reformers one day, Catholics the next, both suffered equally under his capricious decrees. Doctrine was wielded not as a spiritual guide, but as a weapon to suppress dissent and tighten his grip. He demanded unity, yet bred division, ruled through fear, yet feared his own subjects. The England he shaped was a kingdom fractured by mistrust and terror, reflecting the fractured monarch who ruled it. No longer the charismatic Renaissance prince, Henry VIII had become a tyrant ensnared in his own delusions, a ruler who mistook obedience for love, silence for loyalty, and absolute power for divine right. He did not govern with foresight or justice. Instead, he governed against shadows, haunted by enemies born from his own fractured mind. In that haunting, he became a ghost himself, a specter ruling a kingdom consumed by fear. The final years of Henry VIII's life were a shadowy reflection of the king he once was, a man who had been full of vigor, ambition, and fiery passion, now worn down by time, illness, and the weight of his own obsessions. Imagine the once mighty monarch, whose presence had filled grand halls and battlefields alike, now confined largely to his chambers, moving with difficulty and surrounded by a court that no longer felt like home, but a gilded prison. His body had betrayed him utterly. The festering wound in his leg refused to heal, turning into a grotesque reminder of his mortality. Pain, both physical and emotional, dominated his days and nights. Gone were the days when Henry could ride out hunting or joust with his knights. Instead, he was often bedridden or transported on a litter, a pale shadow of the robust king who had once commanded armies and sparked religious revolutions. His size, which had ballooned over the years due to inactivity and health complications like diabetes and possibly gout, made movement even more painful and taxing. But it wasn't just his body that was failing. Henry's mind was also in decline, clouded by the constant pain and by the dark thoughts that plagued him. The paranoia that had begun years earlier grew stronger, and with it came harsh decrees and swift punishments aimed at anyone he suspected of disloyalty or treachery. His relationships with his children became even more complicated. Edward, his young son and heir, was still a fragile boy under the watchful eyes of tutors and advisors. Mary and Elizabeth, his daughters, were both caught in the complicated religious and political upheavals he had helped ignite, their futures uncertain in a kingdom still torn between Catholicism and the new Protestant faith. The weight of securing his dynasty rested heavily on Henry's shoulders. His obsession with his legacy never wavered, and his health problems only intensified his desperation. Despite his frailty, Henry remained fiercely proud and unyielding, often issuing commands and ruling with an iron fist until his very last days. Yet behind the tough exterior, there were glimpses of a man who knew his time was running out, who perhaps felt the burden of the path he had carved for England and for his family. Courtiers whispered of a king who, in quieter moments, reflected on his past mistakes and lost loves, haunted by what could have been. The palace halls grew quieter as Henry's strength ebbed away. The grandeur faded, replaced by a somber mood that recognized the end of an era was near. In these final years, Henry VIII was not just a king fighting for survival, but a man confronting the toll of his choices, his ambitions, and the unforgiving passage of time. In those final years, Henry VIII's once ironclad grip on England grew more desperate as his body betrayed him utterly. The vigorous, commanding figure who had roamed battlefields and courts alike was now confined to a throne barely able to bear his grotesquely swollen frame. His face, once a symbol of regal strength and youthful charisma, had distorted into a swollen mask of pain and decay. His breath came in ragged gasps, foul and labored, a stark contrast to the booming voice that once echoed through Westminster halls. The king who had commanded armies, reshaped religions, and shattered alliances was now a prisoner of his own failing flesh, a tragic monument to the merciless passage of time. But physical decline was only one aspect of his humiliation. The more his body weakened, the more his power unraveled beneath the surface. Once respected and feared, Henry became an object of whispered scorn within his own court. Ministers and nobles, who had once scrambled to please or fear him, began to regard him with a cold detachment. Foreign ambassadors no longer sent glowing reports, but speculated openly about the fragility of the English throne. Paranoia gnawed at the king's mind. Phantom enemies lurked everywhere, and loyalty was a fragile illusion. His decrees still commanded obedience, but that obedience was brittle, motivated by fear rather than respect. The king's paranoia turned the court into a theater of suspicion, where sycophants whispered lies to appease his fragile ego, and even a misstep in speech could mean a sudden, violent fall from grace. Even those closest to him contributed to his humiliation. His sixth wife, Catherine Parr, was a survivor, adept at navigating the treacherous waters of court politics. Her care was cautious, more calculated than compassionate, as she watched the king's slow descent with a measured wariness. Henry's children, once terrified subjects, had learned to keep their distance, their eyes on the prize that would come after their father's inevitable demise. The palace itself, once a radiant symbol of Tudor power and splendor, became a shadowed tomb where the king's every breath was a reminder of decay and defeat. Gone were the days of jousts and celebrations, now only silence and dread remained. When Henry VIII finally died, it was not with the triumphant roar of a conqueror, nor the dignity of a monarch whose legacy would inspire generations. Instead, he slipped away amid whispered rumors, growing resentment, and a nation worn thin by years of turmoil and tyranny. His final humiliation was complete. A once mighty king, brought low not by a rival's sword, but by his own excess, cruelty, and frailty. No monarch in English history had fallen so far, so thoroughly undone by the very crown he wore. Yet even in death, Henry's shadow loomed large, a dark testament to the peril of unchecked ambition, reminding all who followed that power without restraint is ultimately fragile and fleeting. Henry VIII's death marked the end of an era, but the legacy he left was far from the triumphant saga of greatness he once imagined. Instead, it was a fractured kingdom, scarred by religious upheaval, political terror, and the ruthless consolidation of absolute authority. The England he bequeathed was a land forever altered, no longer governed by the steady hand of custom or reason, but ruled through fear, suspicion, and brutal power wielded like a weapon. His reign fundamentally reshaped the monarchy, elevating the king from a figurehead among nobles to a near-divine sovereign whose will was law. But this transformation came at a catastrophic cost. The loyalty once earned through respect and leadership gave way to obedience forced by fear. Counsel became a dangerous game, suspicion poisoned relationships, and blood was spilled in the name of securing obedience. The institutions Henry ravaged, the church, parliament, and nobility, bore deep wounds that festered for generations. The seeds of instability he planted would germinate into decades of conflict and upheaval. Yet, amidst all the betrayal, destruction, and cruelty, Henry's name echoed through history. not as a wise or just ruler, but as a relentless force, an iron fist cloaked in regal splendor. He was a king who bent a nation to his will through intimidation and violence, shattering families and alliances alike in his unyielding quest for control. His vanity forged chains that bound a kingdom to his whims, and those chains would tighten long after his death. His final years, grotesque, paranoid, isolated, stand as a stark prophecy. Power without restraint consumes itself. Henry VIII's tomb holds no glory, no peace. It carries only the weight of ruin, a brutal reminder that absolute power, no matter how grand, devours the very soul that commands it. In death, Henry VIII became more than a man. He became a warning, a chilling whisper echoing through the corridors of history. Absolute power destroys all, even the king who wields it.